My son's wife and in-laws despised me. Driving to their mansion, I stopped to help a woman fix her car. They banished me to the servants' table for arriving late. Then that same woman walked into their party, headed straight for me. She announced she was a billionaire. But that wasn't the biggest shock. Barbara adjusted the floral scarf around her neck and glanced at the envelope once more. It was ivory, embossed with gold lettering, ornate, stiff, cold. It came 3 days ago, addressed formally as Mrs. Barbara Collins, with no warmth, no message inside beyond the time, date, and address. The birthday party of Richard Langston, her daughter-in-law's father, at their sprawling estate in Westchester. It had all the flavor of an obligation, not a gesture of welcome. And yet, Barbara had decided to go. The weather was warm for late spring, the kind that reminded her of school field trips when she was still teaching. She had retired 2 years ago, after almost 4 decades in the classroom. It was a quiet retirement, no cruises, no fuss. That wasn't her way. Her joy came from the ordinary things, her garden, her books, a call from her son. And yet, here she was, stepping into a world that had never made room for her. Barbara's son, Eric, had married Amanda Langston 5 years ago. From the start, Amanda's family had made their feelings clear. They were polite, always polite, but never warm. Richard and Carol Langston carried themselves like royalty, and Barbara, a retired public school teacher who drove a 15-year-old sedan and brought her own pies to family dinners, was never going to be more than a tolerated outsider. She had only agreed to attend today because of Eric. He had called the night before, his voice caught between loyalty and guilt. "It'd mean a lot if you came, Mom. Just, be patient with them, okay?" She had smiled and told him not to worry. But now, as she turned onto the long tree-lined drive of the estate, she felt a familiar tightness in her chest. She didn't belong here. Not among the columns and marble, the cars that gleamed like showroom models, or the carefully manicured grounds with hedges trimmed into unnatural perfection. At the top of the drive, a valet approached. Barbara stepped out, clutching her modest handbag. The young man looked momentarily confused, as if she might be a lost neighbor or a housekeeper arriving on the wrong day. "Are you here for the Langston event?" he asked. "Yes. I'm Eric Collins's mother." "Oh. Right. Please head around to the main entrance." He took her keys hesitantly, like her car might stain the valet circle. Barbara gave him a small smile and walked up the stone steps. Inside, everything smelled of waxed floors, lilies, and money. A woman in a black dress with a clipboard greeted her at the door. "Name?" "Barbara Collins." The woman scanned her list. "Ah. Yes. You're late." Barbara blinked. "I had a small delay on the road. If you could please follow the hallway and take the service passage to the back. The kitchen staff will direct you from there." Excuse me?" The woman looked up, her tone unchanged. "Mr. Langston asked that all guests arriving after 2:30 be seated in the auxiliary space. The main program has already started." Auxiliary space. Barbara followed the directions silently, her shoes echoing faintly against the polished floor. She passed towering portraits of long-dead ancestors and dining rooms set with crystal and silver. Eventually, she was led to a smaller room tucked behind the kitchen, a secondary dining area clearly meant for overflow. There were a few others there, mostly catering staff on break, a couple of distant relatives chatting quietly. The chairs were folding ones. No one looked up when she entered. At the far end of the room, she could glimpse the main hall through a decorative archway. There, under a grand chandelier, sat the Langstons, glowing in designer wear and confidence. Amanda stood beside her father, smiling, her hair swept into an elegant twist. Eric sat beside her, a little stiff, eyes flickering toward the auxiliary room once, then away. Barbara found a seat at the corner table, her back straight, her hands in her lap. No one came to greet her. No one offered a drink. The clatter from the kitchen blended with the polite laughter from the other room. Eventually, Amanda appeared in the doorway. She didn't cross into the room, but her eyes met Barbara's briefly. "Oh, you made it," she said, her tone cool. "Sorry about the seating. Daddy wanted things a certain way, and you did arrive, well, a bit late." Barbara opened her mouth to respond, but Amanda was already turning away, her heels clicking back into the polished world from which Barbara had always been excluded. She sat for a while, staring at the untouched glass of water in front of her. Every part of her told her to leave, to take her dignity and go. But she had promised Eric. So she stayed, invisible among strangers, wondering what she was doing there at all. Then, outside the window beside her, a flash of movement caught her eye. A vintage car, cherry red, elegant and out of place, was pulling up to the estate. And from it stepped a woman in an emerald dress, striking in both posture and presence. Barbara leaned slightly toward the glass. She recognized the woman immediately. Vivian. And with her arrival, something began to shift in the air. The drive to Westchester had started like any other, calm, predictable, with nothing but the hum of the engine and the occasional chirp of birds overhead. The sky was clear, a pale stretch of blue behind budding treetops. Barbara had taken the slower scenic route, one she remembered from when Eric was younger and they used to take Sunday drives out of the city. The highway was faster, yes, but colder, more cars, more tension, less soul. She wasn't in a rush. Not truly. If she arrived a little late, she figured it wouldn't matter. After all, her presence wasn't eagerly anticipated. The road curved gently around a cluster of old oaks when she saw it, an older model car, probably from the 80s, parked awkwardly on the shoulder with the hood up and steam rising faintly. A figure stood beside it, waving. At first, Barbara considered driving on. This wasn't the city, but you still heard stories. And she had somewhere to be, no matter how unwelcoming it might be. Still, something tugged at her, some small instinct, maybe the same one that made her carry extra bottles of water in the trunk or keep a first aid kit in the glove compartment. She slowed down, checked her mirrors, and pulled onto the gravel. The woman beside the broken-down car straightened as Barbara stepped out. She was tall, wearing dark trousers and a blouse that looked stylish but sensible, her hair pulled back into a loose bun that framed her face with effortless grace. There was something poised about her, but not distant. She wasn't panicking, but it was clear she didn't know what to do next. "Need a hand?" Barbara asked, approaching carefully. The woman looked up, eyes immediately warm. "That would be incredible. I think the engine overheated. I tried calling for help, but I have no signal." Barbara walked around to the front of the car and peered under the hood. The engine hissed, and she took a cautious step back. "It's steaming, all right. You probably pushed it a bit far. Do you have any coolant?" "In the trunk, I think," the woman said. "I just bought this car last week. Thought I'd try something vintage, you know? Didn't realize it came with personality." Barbara chuckled. "Vintage always comes with attitude. Let's see what we can do." Together, they opened the trunk. Barbara retrieved a half-full container of coolant and unscrewed the cap of the radiator carefully once the steam had slowed. She worked methodically, explaining her steps as she went. The woman listened, asked questions, even offered her a cloth to wipe her hands with when they finished. It was the kind of encounter Barbara hadn't had in a long time, organic, kind, without pretense. "I'm Vivian, by the way," the woman said, once the car was running again with a hesitant but steady purr. She extended her hand. "Barbara." "Well, Barbara, I owe you. Seriously. If you hadn't stopped, I'd still be standing here until dark." Barbara shook her head. "No need. Just glad you're all right." Vivian smiled, then looked at her watch. "I'm actually headed to a party nearby. A birthday. Might be running a bit behind now." Barbara blinked. "A birthday?" "Yes. Some client of mine. I get roped into these things more than I'd like." Barbara tilted her head. "Wouldn't happen to be the Langstons, would it?" Vivian's brows lifted in surprise. Richard Langston? That's the one. I didn't realize you were going too. I am. Though I doubt we're expected to arrive in the same way. Vivian gave a soft laugh. You'd be surprised. There was something about the way she said it. Something layered and deliberate. Before Barbara could ask more, Vivian's phone pinged. She glanced at it, frowned, and sighed. Finally, a signal. I better get going before they send someone looking for me. But listen, thank you, Barbara. Truly. Barbara gave a modest wave and watched as Vivian's car pulled away. The red paint glinted in the sunlight before disappearing around the bend. There was something familiar about her, something unplaceable. But there wasn't time to think on it. Barbara checked her watch and sighed. She was now significantly late. A delay that would, as she would soon find out, cost her more than just a place at the table. By the time she arrived at the Langston estate, the rest had unfolded as cruelly as it had swiftly, redirected at the door, seated far from her son, acknowledged as an afterthought. That brief moment of kindness on the roadside already felt like a lifetime ago, swallowed by the grandeur and disregard that filled the Langston mansion. Barbara sat quietly at her assigned table in the auxiliary room, sipping water that had long gone lukewarm. She didn't look toward the main dining hall anymore. The distance was too great, and the sting too fresh. Instead, she let her thoughts drift back to that red car, the heat rising off the engine, the scent of lavender that lingered in Vivian's presence. A strange woman, elegant and self-possessed, with eyes that had seen far more than she let on. Something about Vivian's calm felt cultivated. Not the calm of someone used to ease, but someone who had fought for every ounce of poise she carried. Barbara had seen that kind of resilience before, in single mothers at PTA meetings, in colleagues who worked 2 jobs to keep their families afloat, in herself, when life had given her no easy exits. But Vivian was different, cloaked in mystery and wearing it like armor. From the back of the estate, the sound of clinking glasses and polite laughter echoed like static. A speech was starting. She could hear Richard's voice, loud, proud, performative. Barbara didn't listen. Her eyes remained on the soft lace pattern of the tablecloth in front of her, tracing the floral shapes with her finger like she used to do with Eric's picture books when he was a child. A small, soothing ritual to remind herself that the noise beyond the walls didn't define her worth. Minutes passed. Then, without warning, a stir rippled through the air. It started with the shuffling of shoes in the hallway. Then hushed voices. Movement at the far end of the auxiliary room. Barbara turned slightly in her chair, and for a moment, everything paused. Through the ornate doorway, a figure appeared, tall, radiant, confident. Vivian. But not the roadside Vivian in trousers and grease-stained sleeves. This Vivian wore a deep emerald gown that shimmered with every step, tailored to perfection. Her hair was swept up into an elegant twist, and she was flanked by 2 figures, a man in a crisp suit and a woman with a tablet, whispering updates into her ear. Heads turned as she entered the main hall. Then, slowly, every head began to turn toward Barbara. Not because of her, of course. Because Vivian, without hesitating, without so much as glancing at the hosts or the chandeliers or the elaborate cake at the center of the room, made her way directly through the crowd, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. She walked right toward the auxiliary room. Toward Barbara. Barbara stood slowly, confused, heart beating louder with each step the woman took. Vivian stopped before her. And smiled. "You're exactly who I hoped to see." Barbara could feel every eye now turned in their direction. She felt her cheeks warm, not with embarrassment, but with something else. Something sharp, and new. Recognition. Not from strangers. But from a woman who saw her. Vivian leaned in slightly, her voice low and clear. "I told you this party would be surprising." Barbara tried to respond, but before she could, Vivian turned to the crowd that had now gathered in awkward silence. And with a voice that could cut through crystal, she said, "This woman saved me today." And that was only the beginning. Barbara did not move. The room, once filled only with the quiet clatter of catering staff and the low murmurs of unacknowledged guests, now held a silence so thick it felt like fabric being drawn over the air. Vivian's declaration had sliced through the ambient indifference like a blade. And yet, Barbara stood motionless, her hands slightly trembling at her sides, unsure whether to speak or vanish. She had no time to decide. Vivian placed a hand gently on Barbara's shoulder, anchoring her to the moment. She didn't hesitate. No questions, no pretense. Just helped me. Heads had begun to turn fully now. Not just those in the auxiliary room but guests from the main hall, who had followed the sound of Vivian's voice and now peered into the secondary space like they had discovered an exhibit in a forgotten wing. Amanda was among them. Her smile was frozen, strained with confusion and the barely contained panic of someone watching the narrative spiral out of her grasp. Vivian stepped aside slightly, still close enough to Barbara to make her point unmistakably clear. And yet, I find her seated here. Away from the event. Away from everyone else. Someone want to explain that to me? It was not a request. Barbara felt her breath hitch. Her instinct was to deflect, to make an excuse. To spare Amanda or Richard or Carol the discomfort. But before she could say anything, Richard's voice rose from behind the cluster of guests. It's just a misunderstanding. We didn't expect the seating to become an issue. We had very specific timings, and some of the arrangements were last minute. Vivian's eyes didn't leave Barbara. This woman helped a stranger on the side of the road with no thought of recognition. And you banished her to the back of the house because she was late? Carol, now beside her husband, interjected. It wasn't meant to be punishment. She was simply placed in the auxiliary dining area because the main program had already started. We didn't want to cause disruption. Vivian turned her gaze to Carol, cool and unblinking. Disruption? You're describing a person as if she were noise in your schedule. Barbara felt the heat rise in her chest. The attention, though vindicating in a twisted way, was overwhelming. She wasn't used to being spoken for, especially not like this. The last time anyone had defended her publicly was decades ago, when Eric had stood up for her in middle school after a student mocked her for being just a teacher. But even that moment had felt quieter than this. Eric stood behind the crowd, caught in a limbo of loyalty. His face was pale. He looked like he wanted to step forward, but he remained still, watching. Amanda reached for his arm, perhaps in a silent plea for damage control, but he shrugged her off gently. Vivian faced Barbara again. Would you walk with me? Barbara nodded before her brain had caught up. Together, they moved past the stunned guests and into the main room, where the string quartet had long stopped playing and the waitstaff stood awkwardly by the walls, unsure of whether to keep serving drinks. The opulence of the room, the glittering chandeliers, the overflowing buffet, the imported orchids on every table, now felt shallow, performative, almost absurd. Vivian motioned toward an empty settee near the large bay windows, overlooking the manicured lawn. As they sat, a hush remained over the crowd, the kind that signaled something was unraveling but no one quite knew how to stop it. Barbara leaned slightly toward her. I didn't mean to cause all of this. Vivian smiled faintly. You didn't. They did. From across the room, Amanda approached. Her expression had shifted into one of performative hospitality, the kind Barbara had seen countless times since the wedding, smiles like masks, concern like theater. Vivian, Amanda began, her tone soft, too polished. I had no idea you knew my mother-in-law. I didn't, Vivian replied, her voice velvet but unmistakably sharp. Until today. Amanda hesitated. Well, I'm so glad you two found each other. That's really special. She turned to Barbara, her smile straining further. You should have told me you met someone on the way, Barbara. We could have adjusted seating. Vivian cut in. Barbara told no one because she didn't know I was coming here. Which makes the way she was treated all the more telling, doesn't it? Amanda blinked, caught between defense and diplomacy. It's just, family dynamics are complicated. No, Vivian said, standing, what's complicated is watching people dress up their cruelty as protocol. Barbara could feel Amanda's composure starting to crack. Her jaw tightened, and she cast a quick glance toward her parents, who were now whispering fiercely to each other by the far table. The other guests, unsure of whether to remain bystanders or participants, hovered in awkward clusters, sipping champagne more out of necessity than enjoyment. Vivian, now standing fully in the center of the room, turned toward the guests. "I'm not here to cause a scene. But I do believe in accountability. When someone shows kindness, when they help without being asked, when they expect nothing in return, that should mean something. And when others try to diminish that, push it into the shadows, that should mean something too." No one responded. Not Richard. Not Carol. Not Amanda. The silence did the speaking. Barbara, still seated, looked around the room. For the first time, people were looking at her not with dismissal or polite disinterest, but with attention. With curiosity. Some with guilt. She stood slowly, her voice soft but steady. "I didn't come here to disrupt anything. I came because my son asked me to. I don't expect much from this family. I never have. But today, I remembered that kindness doesn't need to be loud to matter." Eric finally stepped forward. "Mom." Barbara turned to him, unsure of what to expect. But his face, torn, uncertain, held something new. Resolve. He looked past Amanda, past her parents, and met Vivian's gaze. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For seeing her." Vivian gave a single nod. Amanda's voice cracked slightly. "Eric, can I talk to you privately for a second?" He didn't answer. Not yet. The air was still thick with unspoken reckonings, with eyes waiting for direction. Barbara remained calm, even as the center of attention, because for the first time, she wasn't being diminished, she was being seen. Not because of who she pretended to be, but because of who she always was. And though none of them knew it yet, the night had only just begun to unravel. Vivian's presence had not merely disturbed the atmosphere of the party, it had upended it. The very architecture of the gathering, so carefully constructed by Richard and Carol to reflect control, prestige, and exclusivity, now seemed to wobble under the weight of a single unexpected variable. Guests had stopped smiling. Conversations had halted mid-sentence. Forks and knives hovered above plates, waiting. At first, some assumed it must have been a case of mistaken identity. After all, Vivian was not just well-dressed, she was dazzling. Her gown, a deep green that mirrored the rolling lawns beyond the tall windows, hugged her like it had been crafted for her alone. Her heels clicked against the polished marble with precision, as if each step was chosen for effect. She exuded an energy that was not loud, but undeniable. And that energy led her directly, unflinchingly, to Barbara. The room watched the unexpected connection unfold with the wary eyes of people witnessing a shift in power dynamics they couldn't yet understand. It wasn't just about status. It wasn't just about wealth. There was something else at play, something more dangerous to the fragile ecosystem of social pretenses cultivated by the Langstons. Amanda had retreated to the far end of the room, whispering furiously to Richard, her voice clipped with tension. Carol had vanished, likely into one of the smaller lounges where she could be heard without being seen. Eric stood somewhere in between it all, silent, as if waiting for the dust to settle before he could choose a side. Vivian had taken a seat beside Barbara, but not the one offered by the Langston staff. She had dragged one of the high-backed chairs away from the central dining table and positioned it beside Barbara's modest folding chair, leveling the playing field. The move had not gone unnoticed. "I must admit," Vivian said quietly to Barbara, her eyes still forward, "I didn't expect to recognize anyone at this party. But seeing you again, it changed everything." Barbara offered a small smile, unsure what to say. She had never been the center of any event, much less one hosted by people who looked at her like a wrinkle in their otherwise smooth design. "You didn't have to say anything. I was fine." Vivian turned her head slowly, her expression soft but serious. "You were not fine. You were being disrespected. There's a difference between being silent and being silenced. You've had too much of the latter. before Barbara could reply, a tall man in a dark suit approached. He wore an earpiece and carried a quiet authority in the way he scanned the room. He leaned toward Vivian and spoke just above a whisper. "Ms. Dalton, security confirms the perimeter is set. Press has been notified not to breach the event grounds. Your statement is ready when you are." Vivian nodded once, almost imperceptibly. "Not yet." Barbara blinked. "Press?" Vivian offered her a sideways glance. "I was scheduled to make an appearance later this week at a corporate gala. But someone leaked my itinerary this morning. So it appears a few outlets got wind that I'd be in Westchester earlier than planned." "You're famous?" Vivian didn't answer directly. "Let's just say I'm often observed." It was then that Richard attempted a recovery. He strode back into the room with a rehearsed smile and a glass of wine in each hand, offering one to Vivian. "You must forgive the confusion earlier," he said, voice rich with false humility. "Had we known you were coming so soon, we would have ensured the welcome was more appropriate." Vivian did not take the glass. Barbara watched closely as Richard tried to manage the narrative with charm, the same charm he used to dominate dinner conversations and belittle opinions with grace. This party, as you know, was meant to be a celebration of tradition. Family. And sometimes, in managing logistics, small mistakes are made. Vivian stood, looking directly into his eyes. It wasn't a mistake. It was a hierarchy. One that placed your comfort above someone else's dignity. Richard's smile faltered just slightly. "Surely we don't need to turn this into something political." "It already is," Vivian replied. "Every social gathering is. The question is whether you're willing to acknowledge who you exclude." Barbara could feel the tension ripple across the room like a vibration. For the first time, the masks were slipping. People were whispering more openly now, some pulling out their phones discreetly, others stepping out into the hall, pretending to take calls but really escaping the heat. From a far corner, a younger guest, one of Amanda's cousins, perhaps, approached timidly. "Excuse me," she said to Vivian, "I just wanted to say that what you did, standing up like that, it was really inspiring." Vivian nodded graciously. "Thank you." The young woman then turned to Barbara. "And you? I hope they treat you better after this." "They should." Barbara was too stunned to reply, but she gave a polite nod. From behind them, Amanda re-entered the room with Carol in tow. Carol's makeup was still flawless, but her posture was tighter, more defensive. Carol's voice was syrupy. "Vivian, darling, this must be such a strange detour for you. We had no idea you and Barbara were connected." Vivian turned fully now. "We weren't. Until today. And yet somehow, she showed more grace in 20 minutes than most people here have in their entire lives." Carol laughed nervously. "Oh, come now. Surely you're exaggerating." Vivian's gaze didn't waver. "Am I?" Carol blinked, then turned her attention to Barbara. "Of course, Barbara has always been welcome in our home. Haven't you, dear?" Barbara, for the first time in a long while, chose not to rescue the moment with pleasantries. "I've been present. Whether I was welcome is a separate matter." The silence after that was heavy. Vivian finally took a step back and addressed the room again, this time with more calm than sharpness. "There's no need for anyone to feel attacked. But there is a need for reflection. Every gathering tells a story, not just about who is invited, but about who is acknowledged." She turned back to Barbara. "I'd like you to sit with me for the rest of the evening. If that's all right with you." Barbara hesitated. Not because she didn't want to, but because it felt like stepping into a world that had always felt just out of reach. But Vivian's hand extended with quiet assurance. And so Barbara stood, accepted, and let herself be led. They moved together to one of the central tables, one previously reserved for the hosts and a few elite guests. Vivian motioned to have 2 chairs cleared and replaced with more comfortable ones, and when Barbara sat, it was not at the margins. It was at the heart of the celebration. And as glasses clinked again and conversations resumed, Barbara noticed something strange. People were watching her. Not with pity. Not with confusion. But with attention. With respect. And perhaps, even a hint of regret. She said nothing. But her silence now held weight. The main hall, once vibrating with ambient music and superficial laughter, now operated on a different frequency. The notes of classical piano returned faintly through the speakers, as though someone behind the scenes tried to coax the party back into its original rhythm. But the tension had not dispersed, it had only learned to settle itself politely into the crevices of conversation, into the careful sips of champagne and the hushed glances aimed at the woman now seated beside Vivian Dalton. Barbara sat straight, unsure of what to do with her hands, unsure even of how to position her feet beneath the expansive tablecloth. She wasn't used to this kind of table. It was round, wide, the centerpiece nearly blocking her view of the guests across from her. The chairs were plush, the kind that made you feel like you needed permission to sit in them. Her water glass had a lemon wedge. Her napkin was folded into an origami swan. It was all theater. And somehow, she was now on stage. Vivian, in contrast, sat like someone who'd built the theater herself. She crossed one leg over the other with grace, accepting the champagne that a waiter offered without ever breaking eye contact with the room. She made no effort to reclaim control of the conversation, she didn't need to. Her presence had already done that. What she seemed to be waiting for, Barbara thought, was something else. Something deliberate. Amanda and her parents hadn't approached again. Richard remained in the background, now glued to his phone, whispering updates to Carol between forced smiles. Amanda sat 2 tables over, locked in murmured consultation with a middle-aged man who looked like a lawyer or perhaps a PR advisor. The discomfort on their faces betrayed the chaos brewing beneath their tailored surfaces. They weren't used to feeling outmaneuvered, certainly not on their home turf. When dessert was served, miniature soufflés with burnt sugar tops and gold-dusted raspberries, Vivian didn't touch hers. Instead, she stood. No one had introduced her, no speech had been scheduled, but it didn't matter. The clinking of forks stopped almost immediately. All eyes turned to her. "I know this wasn't supposed to be about me," Vivian said, her voice calm and cool, as if she were giving a quarterly report. This evening was arranged to celebrate the life and legacy of Richard Langston, a man whose business acumen, real estate ventures, and philanthropic contributions have been generously lauded by the community. And rightfully so. There was polite applause, though weak. A few guests nodded. Richard gave a small, tight smile. Vivian continued. "But tonight, I'd like to redirect the spotlight for a brief moment. Not because I want to diminish anyone's accomplishments, but because something happened earlier today that redefined what legacy means to me." Barbara felt the blood drain from her face. Vivian turned to her. "This morning, I was stranded on a rural road in a car that had more charm than reliability. A dozen people passed me. Not one stopped. Except her." She gestured toward Barbara. "She didn't know who I was. She didn't ask where I was going or what I did. She simply saw someone in need and acted. Not because it was convenient. Not because she expected recognition. But because that's who she is." Barbara shifted slightly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I'm often surrounded by people who only speak to me because of what I can offer them. Investors. Strategists. Opportunists. Rarely do I meet someone whose kindness is entirely free of transaction." Barbara reminded me of someone I knew long ago, someone who helped shape the person I became. Someone whose generosity wasn't a show, but a way of living. The guests listened, rapt. A few looked at Barbara now with wide eyes, the woman they had ignored or pitted an hour earlier now framed in an entirely different light. Vivian exhaled and straightened. "I'm Vivian Dalton, CEO of Dalton Holdings. We manage over $80 billion in global assets across 5 continents. I've built and acquired companies, transformed small firms into international names, and spent the last decade trying to make room for more voices at the table." The name hit the room like a dropped chandelier. Some people gasped. Others whispered her name as if trying to confirm it aloud. A few guests had already started Googling her under the table. I was invited here tonight as a client, Vivian continued. But I'm staying because of a woman who reminded me that wealth means nothing if it isn't used with intention. She paused and looked directly at Richard and Carol. And while this home may be beautiful, while this party may be elegant, what I've witnessed here tonight has made me reconsider who I choose to associate my name with. A heavy silence followed. Vivian turned back to Barbara. So I've made a decision. Barbara shook her head slightly, almost imperceptibly, but Vivian gently placed a hand over hers. Tomorrow morning, Dalton Holdings will finalize a contribution of $5 million to New York's Public Education Advancement Fund. In Barbara's name. To honor her decades of service as a teacher and the quiet impact she's had on generations of children. There was an audible intake of breath across the room. A few hands froze mid-motion. Champagne nearly slipped from one woman's grip. Barbara stared ahead, her lips parted in disbelief. Vivian, no. I don't need. I know you don't, Vivian replied softly. That's why it matters. Amanda stood up from her table, her face a mix of shock and fury. This is absurd. You barely know her. You met her on the side of the road. Vivian didn't even flinch. And yet, she showed me more humanity than anyone in this house. Richard stepped forward now, trying to salvage whatever image remained. We are grateful for your generosity, Vivian, truly. I think we may have gotten off on the wrong foot. Perhaps we should discuss how we can support your philanthropic efforts in a more formal capacity. Vivian raised her hand. No. This isn't a negotiation. This isn't a collaboration. This is a statement. She turned to the guests again. Many of you know me. Some of you have worked with me. But I want to be very clear, what I saw tonight, how a woman was treated because she was late, because she wasn't dressed to your standard, because she didn't come from your world, that is everything I've spent my life pushing against. Her words settled like iron across the room. Barbara, still seated, felt her heart pounding. She wasn't angry. She wasn't embarrassed. She was overwhelmed. The spotlight had always been a place for others. She was a background person. A helper. A supporter. And now, here she was, elevated not by design, but by a simple choice to do what was right when no one was watching. Vivian leaned down, her voice quiet but firm. You belong at this table. And so do others like you. Barbara blinked away the sting in her eyes and nodded once. The applause, when it came, was hesitant at first. A few claps. Then more. Then the room filled with a kind of reverent sound, respectful, if still unsure. It wasn't celebration. It was recognition. And recognition was more than Barbara had ever hoped for. The air inside the Langston estate had grown unusually dense. Not from heat or noise, but from a silence that vibrated underneath the surface. No one quite knew how to recover after Vivian Dalton's impromptu speech and multimillion-dollar announcement. Conversations resumed in halting fragments. Some guests murmured compliments about Vivian's conviction. Others retreated to the bar to recalibrate their expressions, wiping invisible sweat from their foreheads as if someone might see past their feigned indifference. At the center of it all, Barbara remained seated beside Vivian, holding the glass of water in her hands like an anchor. She had not touched the soufflé on her plate, nor spoken much since Vivian's announcement. Gratitude swelled in her chest, almost suffocating, not because she had asked for anything, but because someone had handed her back something she'd been quietly denied for years: visibility. Across the room, Richard Langston was fuming. The mask had finally slipped, even if only partially. His attempts to redirect the evening had failed miserably. Vivian had the crowd, the authority, and the money. Worse, she had seized the narrative. For a man used to steering every room he entered, it was a humiliation that sat like acid on his tongue. Carol returned from the lounge with a wineglass clenched tightly in hand. Her walk had changed. No longer the elegant glide of a woman secure in her status, but the brisk, brittle march of someone who sensed the shifting winds. Amanda stood nearby, her arms crossed, jaw rigid. None of them had spoken to Barbara again, not since Vivian had taken the microphone, metaphorically and socially. And Eric, though still unsure where to plant himself, hovered somewhere between silent awe and quiet shame. Vivian, unfazed by the discomfort around her, finally broke the silence between them. "You're holding that glass like it's about to run away." Barbara looked down at her fingers. "I don't know what to do with myself. I haven't been the center of attention since I was 6 and fell into a wedding cake at my cousin's reception." Vivian chuckled. "Well, you handled this better than I imagine you handled the cake." Barbara smiled gently, her voice low. "I'm not sure what I did to deserve all this. I really was just trying to help." Vivian leaned closer. "Exactly. And that's what makes it important." Before Barbara could reply, a woman from the guest list approached. She was tall, with an expensive shawl draped over her shoulders and diamond earrings that glittered even in the low lighting. Her expression was hesitant but curious. "Excuse me," she said, addressing Vivian but glancing at Barbara with something resembling reverence. "Would you mind if I asked, are you really donating $5 million in her name?" Vivian nodded. "That's correct." The woman turned to Barbara. "That's extraordinary. I used to teach before I got married. My mother was a teacher for 35 years. She would have loved this." Barbara found her voice. "It's not about the money. It's about the students. The schools. The places that never get the spotlight." The woman nodded slowly. "Still, you've made a statement just by existing the way you do. Quiet dignity is hard to find these days." She walked away, leaving Barbara feeling both uplifted and strangely disoriented. She looked at Vivian. "I don't know if I'm comfortable being a symbol." Vivian's response was immediate. "Then don't be a symbol. Just keep being yourself. The rest is noise." Across the room, Richard signaled to a member of the catering staff. He murmured something too low to hear, and the server quickly disappeared behind a service door. Moments later, a small group of uniformed servers began discreetly clearing empty plates, even from tables still in use. A premature cleanup effort. Barbara recognized the tactic. It was a reset. A subtle way of regaining control by pretending the moment had passed. Amanda approached Vivian and Barbara again, her movements rehearsed, her face restored to its curated social expression. "I just wanted to thank you both for coming," she said, smiling stiffly. "Truly. This has been a surprising evening. Unexpected, certainly, but enlightening." Vivian tilted her head. "Unexpected is a generous word." Amanda pressed on. "It's clear my parents weren't as considerate as they should have been, and I'll be having that conversation with them privately. But I do hope we can move forward." Barbara finally spoke. "Forward into what?" Amanda blinked. "Excuse me?" "Forward into pretending this didn't happen? That they didn't try to humiliate me? That they haven't been doing it quietly for years while you stood by?" Amanda's posture stiffened. "Barbara, this isn't the time." Vivian's voice sliced through. "No, it's the perfect time. Because no one listens once the party's over." Amanda's eyes narrowed. "Look, I'm trying to be gracious. This is my father's birthday, and your father insulted the one person in this room who's demonstrated real character," Vivian said, standing slowly. "Your grace would be more convincing if it weren't being dragged out like a PR strategy." Eric finally stepped forward. His hands were in his pockets, his shoulders tense. "Amanda, maybe you should stop talking." Amanda turned to him, aghast. "Are you siding with them now?" "I'm not taking sides," he said, though his tone contradicted the words. "I'm just tired of pretending nothing's wrong." Vivian sat again, letting the silence between the couple speak for itself. Carol returned to the room at last, having reapplied her lipstick and summoned the version of herself that hosted charity galas and greeted senators. "Well, it's certainly been an evening to remember," she said to no one in particular. Barbara stood. Her voice, calm and unwavering, cut through the ambient discomfort like a thread pulled cleanly from a fraying sweater. I don't need apologies. I don't need explanations. But I won't sit quietly anymore. Not at this table. Not in this family. Not in my life. Several guests turned their heads. Amanda's face turned cold. Carol's froze entirely. But Richard, perhaps realizing the futility of performance in the presence of someone like Vivian, said nothing. Barbara looked at Eric. You're a grown man. You've made your choices. But you've also watched me be treated like less. And I wonder, after all these years, if you even noticed. Eric opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came. Vivian stood beside Barbara. Let's go. They walked together across the hall. Each step seemed to echo louder than the last. The chatter stopped. The music stilled. For the second time that evening, every eye followed Barbara, not as a shadow at the edge of the gathering, but as a figure at its center. As the front door came into view, the night air beyond it promising something simpler and more honest than anything left behind, Barbara felt the weight lift, one insult at a time, one quiet injustice shaken off like dust. She had arrived alone. She would not leave the same. Barbara didn't walk quickly as she exited the hall. She didn't need to. Her pace was steady, deliberate, quiet. Vivian stayed beside her, and though they didn't speak, there was something almost sacred in their silence, like two women who had both grown accustomed to weathering storms, but had never expected to find shelter in one another. The cool air of the front corridor brushed against Barbara's skin as the heavy doors ahead swung open, a valet standing awkwardly to one side as if unsure whether to offer assistance or simply get out of the way. Before they reached the threshold, however, something unexpected happened. A voice rose behind them. Excuse me, wait. Barbara turned slightly. A woman from the guest list, perhaps in her 50s, stepped forward with cautious steps. Her name tag, something Barbara hadn't noticed earlier, read Cynthia Lorne, Langston Foundation Board. She held a small purse against her waist, as if it were a shield. I just wanted to say, that was brave. What you did in there, Cynthia said. I've been attending these events for years, and I don't think I've ever seen someone call it out. Not like that. Barbara gave her a soft look. I didn't come here to make a scene. I just reached my limit. Cynthia nodded. Well, you weren't the only one. Behind her, another voice chimed in. Then another. Small clusters of guests began approaching them, each one with a different expression, some embarrassed, some ashamed, some simply inspired. They offered hands, words of kindness, confessions whispered like secrets. I always thought the way they treated you was wrong. I was too afraid to say anything before. I'm so sorry for the way you were seated. That wasn't right. Vivian stood back, letting Barbara receive every word, every handshake, every apology. The sudden flow of compassion was not performative, it didn't carry the hollow polish of social theater. These were not the hosts. These were the guests, the quiet observers who had spent their years seated at elegant tables while ignoring the woman at the margins. A younger woman stepped forward next. She looked no older than 30 and wore a green satin dress and glasses that kept sliding down her nose. I used to sit in your classroom, Mrs. Collins. 9th grade English. You used to read poetry aloud at the end of every Friday. Barbara blinked. Clara? The woman nodded, and her voice cracked with emotion. You made me love words. You told me I had a writer's heart even when I was barely passing your class. I never forgot that. Barbara smiled, and for a moment her vision blurred. She hadn't seen Clara in over a decade. And yet, here she was, elegant and grown, full of the same fire Barbara had always hoped her students would carry into the world. I didn't know you were connected to the Langstons, Barbara said. I'm not, really. I'm just someone's plus one. But I recognized you the minute you walked in. Clara turned to Vivian. Thank you for saying what no one else ever dared to. Vivian inclined her head graciously, but remained quiet. She wasn't there to receive praise. One by one, more guests came forward. A man in finance who admitted he had judged Barbara's appearance unfairly. A woman from the neighborhood who had once waved but never spoken to her at the local farmer's market. Even the chef stepped out from the kitchen, still in his whites, to shake Barbara's hand and say, "I hope someone defends me like that one day." The momentum of the moment had shifted entirely. Barbara looked toward the hallway leading back to the main room. From there, she could see Amanda still standing near her table, flanked by her parents. They weren't speaking. They weren't smiling. They were watching. But no one was watching them anymore. The attention had shifted, and they were no longer the sun around which the party orbited. Something more authentic had taken its place. Vivian touched Barbara's elbow gently. "Do you want to go?" Barbara looked around at the guests surrounding her. Then she looked toward the open door and the dark night outside. "No," she said. Vivian raised an eyebrow. Barbara turned to face the room behind her, not the Langstons, but the other guests, people who had stepped forward, who had broken their silence. "I think I've spent enough time letting other people decide when I should leave." The crowd murmured in agreement. Someone clapped softly. Then another. And then Barbara did something she hadn't done in years. She walked back into the main room. She didn't march. She didn't make a scene. She just walked, with the quiet authority of someone who had nothing left to prove and nothing left to fear. She returned to the table where Vivian had sat with her, and without waiting for anyone's permission, she took her seat. Vivian joined her. Soon, others began to migrate toward that table as well. Cynthia. Clara. The chef. A few others who had once been scattered across the edges of the Langston orbit. Now they sat with Barbara, leaning in, starting new conversations. The room's energy tilted further. Even the waitstaff began serving this table with a renewed attentiveness, as if sensing where the pulse of the night now lived. Richard remained frozen near the bar. Carol whispered something sharp to Amanda, whose expression was a mixture of humiliation and panic. Eric had not returned. Perhaps he was outside. Perhaps he was somewhere between guilt and clarity. At the center table, a soft buzz of laughter rose. Genuine, unforced. Vivian leaned in. "How do you feel now?" Barbara took a sip of her water. "Like I'm sitting in the right place for the first time in a long time." Vivian nodded. "Good. Then the rest will sort itself out." And for the first time in decades, Barbara believed that it might. The laughter that circled the table where Barbara now sat was quiet but contagious, like a ripple in still water. Something fundamental had shifted in the atmosphere of the Langston estate. The conversations around the main room no longer orbited Amanda's pristine arrangements or Richard's curated legacy. Instead, subtle undercurrents had begun to gather around the unexpected nucleus, Barbara. It wasn't because she asked for it. She wasn't trying to claim attention or bask in admiration. It was, in fact, the opposite. Barbara spoke with humility, deflecting credit, redirecting compliments toward others. But that only drew more people in. Her authenticity had become a silent gravitational force that neither wealth nor reputation could rival. And Carol Langston felt every inch of that power slipping from her carefully manicured fingers. She stood near the far corner of the room, pretending to enjoy a half-empty flute of Prosecco, her posture stiff beneath the sheen of her designer gown. Every time another guest leaned in toward Barbara, every time someone else left Amanda's circle to join Vivian's, Carol's lips tightened into a flatter line. "She's turning this into a spectacle," Carol whispered to Amanda, keeping her voice low but bitter. 1 hour ago, she was seated with the staff. Amanda didn't respond. Her gaze was fixed on Eric, who had just re-entered the room and taken a seat near the bar alone. He hadn't looked in her direction once. Carol's voice turned sharper. "You let this get away from you." Amanda turned to face her mother, her tone colder than it had been all evening. "I didn't bring Vivian Dalton here. I didn't ask her to take my mother-in-law's side." "No," Carol said, voice growing quiet and calculating, "but you didn't control the fallout either." Across the room, Vivian was leaning back slightly, listening to a man speak about a charter school initiative he'd been developing in Harlem. She was not grandstanding, not dominating the conversation. She was absorbing it, something that Carol found more dangerous than arrogance. Carol handed her glass to a passing server and began to walk back toward the central table, her heels tapping sharply against the floor. She didn't ask permission. She simply pulled a chair from another table and inserted herself into the conversation. "Barbara," she said, her voice syrupy. "I've been meaning to come over and personally thank you for your patience tonight. I do hope the seating mishap hasn't dampened your experience." Vivian turned slightly in her chair, but Barbara answered before she could. "It didn't dampen anything. It clarified things." Carol offered a paper-thin smile. "Well, I'm glad it worked out in the end." Vivian leaned forward, resting her chin on her hand. "It didn't work out. It was corrected. By force." Carol ignored her. "Barbara, it's funny, you know, I remember when Amanda first brought Eric home. We were so pleased. Such a lovely young man. Raised well. Kind." Barbara nodded, not rising to the bait. "And when we realized your background, education, public service, I remember saying to Richard, there's honor in that. Humble beginnings often shape remarkable people." Vivian tilted her head. "Is that what you said? Because what I heard tonight didn't sound like respect." Carol didn't blink. "Well, sometimes these environments create misunderstandings. You of all people, Vivian, know how tricky appearances can be." Vivian's gaze sharpened, but she let Barbara speak first. "Appearances aren't the problem," Barbara said. "It's the expectations behind them. You expected me to stay quiet. That's why I was seated in the back." Carol's eyes flicked with irritation. "There were over 100 guests. We can't always micromanage." "But you did micromanage," Vivian cut in. "You managed everything but your own prejudice." Carol exhaled slowly. "I suppose this is your idea of progress? Turning a family celebration into a class war." Vivian smiled faintly. "If progress feels like a threat to you, maybe you've mistaken dominance for dignity." Several guests nearby turned their heads toward the table. The volume of the exchange had risen slightly, enough to break through the ambient conversation. Carol noticed this and quickly adjusted her posture, her smile returning like a trained reflex. "Well," she said with a breathy laugh, "this has certainly been an evening for the books." She stood again, brushing an invisible crease from her gown. "Barbara, you're welcome to visit again. Let's just hope next time, the circumstances are calmer." Before Barbara could respond, Vivian stood too. "No need for visits. We'll be seeing each other plenty without the Langstons." Carol's eyes narrowed. "And what exactly does that mean?" Vivian smiled, unbothered. "I'm inviting Barbara to join a private network I chair, a group of women leaders across sectors. Thought it might be refreshing to bring in someone whose success isn't based on inheritance or PR." Carol paused, caught for a split second without a comeback. Vivian's voice lowered. "You've played this game for a long time, Carol. But the board just changed." Without waiting for a response, she turned back to Barbara and gestured toward a fresh dessert plate being placed before them. "You should try this. Apparently the chef studied in Florence." Carol walked away. The moment hung heavy for a beat, but it was broken quickly as conversation returned, now buzzing more with excitement than discomfort. Barbara, once again, found herself at the center, but this time, it was not a spectacle. It was a shift. A visible, tangible redistribution of attention, energy, and respect. She leaned toward Vivian. "You didn't have to humiliate her." Vivian shrugged. "That wasn't humiliation. That was restraint." Barbara allowed herself a rare chuckle. "Still. I don't want to turn into her." "You couldn't if you tried." At that moment, Eric approached their table, standing quietly behind Barbara's chair. He didn't speak right away. He looked not at Vivian, nor at the curious onlookers, but directly at his mother. "I want to talk." If you'll let me. Barbara looked up at him, her eyes calm, her shoulders no longer tense with apology. Not now, she said gently, but firmly. Later. When it's not convenient for you, when it's meaningful. Eric nodded, the weight of her words settling into him like stone. He stepped back and disappeared into the crowd, leaving Barbara in her rightful seat. The night had begun to unravel neatly, the pieces realigning themselves into a new tableau that reflected something far more authentic than the Langston family's polished expectations. Barbara, seated still at the heart of what felt like a newly defined space, watched Vivian across the table as they shared a quiet moment of laughter, markedly different from the tight, masked smiles that had accompanied most of the evening. Around them, the room had softened, conversations flowing with genuine curiosity instead of rehearsed etiquette. As the murmurs around the room settled into conversational hums, Barbara leaned over and whispered, "Can you believe some of them are still here?" Vivian's smile brimmed with warmth. "They stayed because something changed," she said. "Because someone showed them it mattered." Barbara exhaled softly, tracing the rim of her water glass. "It matters more than I ever thought it would." A pause, then Vivian rested her hand over Barbara's. "Your kindness started that ripple." Barbara closed her eyes, holding the moment. But in the quiet between the notes of music and fading laughter, something deeper stirred, a memory she hadn't touched in years, like an old photograph tucked in a drawer. She spoke quietly. "Before Eric, before all of this, I taught in a public middle school in Queens. There was a boy, Jamal. He was bright, tenacious, always wrote stories, but he didn't think he belonged anywhere. One day, he handed me a folded paper. A story. He said I helped him believe his words weren't worth hiding. He's..." She paused, her voice catching. The table felt alive with attention, but she wasn't speaking to them. She was speaking across time. Vivian's gaze was gentle. "What about him?" "He's an engineer now. Lives in Seattle," Barbara said softly. "He emailed me last month. Said he had a breakthrough on a project, and he first thought of me. Told me I helped him see someone needed his mind." There was a tenderness in that truth. A quiet legacy not measured by wealth or acclaim, but by the people whose lives she'd touched when nobody was watching. A gentleman from the table, once an aloof guest, cleared his throat hesitantly. "That story, it's powerful," he said, voice low. "We often forget that impact like that is, maybe the rarest kind of change." Barbara's eyes turned to his, and she realized he was still sitting by her, or had gravitated there while she spoke. "Education is the foundation of so much," he continued. "And we all forget it when we get caught up in dinners and events like this." Barbara shook her head. "I never expected this evening to be about me. I just came for Eric." Vivian reached across and squeezed her hand gently. "And now you've given much more." At that moment, the music shifted, and a new melody, a modern jazz piece, filled the room with relaxed grace. Guests stood, stirred, moved to sip from warming wine, to discuss school budgets or city playgrounds or tomorrow's weather. But the pivot was clear, the axis had shifted. Later, as the crowd thinned, Barbara found herself walking through a hallway toward the library. The shelf-lined walls felt like a safe nook away from the unsettled argument that still hovered at the center of the main hall. She paused before a painting, a pastoral scene she must have passed before without noticing. Something in its muted tones mirrored her own feeling tonight, quiet but persistent. Vivian joined her. "You all right?" she asked softly. Barbara nodded. "Yes. I've spent so much of my life adapting. Fitting into spaces that weren't made for me." Vivian leaned against the frame of the painting. Her voice was firm. "You don't adapt anymore. You define." Barbara looked up at the artwork, then back at Vivian. "Tonight, you reminded me of who I was before fitting in meant shrinking." Vivian smiled. "You're someone worth the space you take." In the flickering light from the hallway sconces, Barbara realized novelty didn't define value. Integrity did. All those years of living modestly, without expectation, hadn't softened her. They had strengthened her. They were still standing there when Eric found them, hesitating in the doorway. His eyes took in his mother, the way she stood, the calm in her posture, the subtle glow of something neither polished nor acknowledged enough. He looked at Vivian, then back at Barbara, and finally spoke. "Can we talk? Now?" Barbara steadied herself. "Yes." She turned to Vivian. "Will you stay?" Vivian nodded. "I'll be right here." As they walked down the hallway toward a quieter wing of the house, illuminated by soft lamplight and calm certainty, Barbara felt something she hadn't in years: peace. Not the brittle peace of compromise, but something softer, steadier, rooted in knowing who she was and what she had quietly shared with the world. And it all began with a kindness, not performance, a redemptive acknowledgement of what virtue, in its most human form, truly looks like. The dining room had been reset for the final course of the evening, though no one was particularly interested in dessert anymore. The plates had been arranged, wine glasses refilled, and the soft flicker of candles danced across silver trays and untouched petit fours. But the mood hadn't returned to what it had been earlier. The crowd had thinned. Some guests had left, others lingered not for the food but to see how the rest of the evening would unfold. They weren't there for Richard Langston's celebration anymore, they were there to witness the aftershocks of everything that had been upended. Barbara followed Eric into the main dining room, not as a shadow, not as a tolerated presence, but as someone who had taken her rightful place, and been seen. Vivian walked behind them at a distance, quiet, composed, her gaze sharp and unwavering. She was no longer navigating the party, she was observing it, waiting for the final act. When they reached the head of the room, Richard was seated again, arms folded, face unreadable. Carol stood behind him, posture erect, her expression tightly controlled. Amanda, near the far wall, paced slowly, her lips moving silently as though rehearsing lines. Barbara sat at the chair closest to the center. Not a seat she was given. A seat she chose. Eric stood beside her, visibly tense. His shoulders hunched forward slightly, hands loosely curled at his sides. There was something different in his face, not just discomfort, but shame trying to shift into accountability. "I need to say something," he began, his voice reaching not just the Langstons, but the guests who had remained nearby. Carol glanced at her husband, but neither interrupted. Amanda slowed her pacing, tilting her head with a thin smile, as though preparing to deflect whatever might come. Eric cleared his throat. "I've spent a lot of years pretending that the way my mother was treated didn't bother me. I told myself it wasn't worth the argument. That keeping the peace was more important than calling things out." Barbara looked down at her folded hands, listening but not rescuing him. She would not protect him from his own honesty. "Not tonight." Eric continued, slower now. "But I was wrong. I let people talk down to her, move her aside, minimize her. And I let myself believe that if I didn't say anything, then I wasn't part of the problem." He paused, searching the room as if expecting someone to stop him. No one did. "Tonight, I watched my mother be treated like someone disposable. And I watched her stay quiet again, not because she agreed with it, but because she spent her life believing she has to take whatever she's given and be grateful for it. That ends now." Amanda laughed bitterly from the corner. "Is this a performance, Eric? Some late-in-life guilt monologue to make yourself feel better?" Eric turned to her. "This is me realizing that I married someone who stood by while her parents humiliated the only woman who's ever had my back unconditionally." Amanda's face flushed, but she didn't speak again. Vivian stepped forward, her voice even. "Your apology, Eric, is necessary. But it's not for show. If you mean it, live it." Richard stood now, clearly done with the spectacle. "This is my house," he said sharply. "This is my celebration, and I won't have it hijacked by lectures and grandstanding." Vivian remained still. "This is your house. But it stopped being your celebration the moment you decided that someone's presence was an inconvenience to your image." Barbara looked up then, meeting Richard's eyes without flinching. "You never wanted me here," she said. "From the first dinner, from the first look at my clothes or my car or the fact that I brought a dish to share like I always did with family. You made it clear I wasn't welcome. Richard scoffed. Don't be dramatic. It was never personal. Barbara smiled faintly. It was always personal. You just made it polite. There was silence again. The kind that falls when truth lands where no one wants it. Vivian stepped beside Barbara. You know, Richard, I've attended enough galas to see what power looks like when it rots. But tonight, I saw what it looks like when it's earned. That's why I'm making the donation in Barbara's name. Not in honor of this event. Not in partnership with this family. Solely for her. Carol narrowed her eyes. We can match the donation. Or exceed it. Vivian laughed softly. You could give 50 million, Carol. It still wouldn't buy you dignity. The tension snapped there. The room, caught between decorum and chaos, hung on the edge of something irreversible. But instead of a final eruption, Barbara stood. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't deliver a rehearsed speech. She simply placed her napkin on the table and said, I think it's time I left. Vivian touched her arm. Do you want me to come with you? Barbara shook her head. No. You've already done more than enough. She turned to Eric. I meant what I said earlier. We'll talk. But not here. Not tonight. He nodded, eyes glossy, lips pressed together as though holding in something heavier than words. As Barbara began walking toward the exit, the room shifted again. Several guests stood. Not because they were obligated, not because someone clinked a glass to initiate a toast, but because it felt right. A silent act of acknowledgement. Of apology. Even the waitstaff paused. Barbara didn't smile or wave. She simply walked, slow and straight, until the doors opened once more and the quiet of the night welcomed her again. Vivian remained behind, watching the guests, the Langstons, the broken script of a party that had tried to erase someone like Barbara and failed spectacularly. Then she turned to Richard and said, without drama or threat, next time you send an invitation, ask yourself who you're really prepared to host. And with that, she too left the table. The night outside the Langston mansion was quiet, but it didn't feel still. The trees swayed gently, the breeze carried the faint scent of trimmed hedges and spring blooms, and the gravel driveway shimmered under soft garden lights. Barbara stood near the edge of the circular drive, her arms crossed lightly over her chest, not in defense but in reflection. Her car, the old sedan she'd driven for years, waited a few feet away, and yet she wasn't ready to leave, not quite. Inside, the house was quieting. The party hadn't officially ended, but its spirit had. What remained were a few clusters of guests murmuring amongst themselves and a handful of others pretending not to stare as power and perception shifted dramatically beneath the surface. Vivian had rejoined a small group of professionals near the side lounge, discussing logistics for the donation she had promised earlier. It was clear that although she had made her point, her presence still commanded a level of reverence that only a few people in the room could even hope to understand. Eric stepped outside not long after Barbara. He approached slowly, unsure whether to close the space between them. His shoes crunched softly against the gravel as he moved, and Barbara turned to face him, expression unreadable. I wasn't sure you'd still be here, he said. I almost wasn't, she replied. But I realized I didn't want to leave feeling like I'd just escaped something. I wanted to leave knowing I faced it. Eric nodded. I understand. Barbara didn't respond right away. She looked past him toward the house, where Amanda was visible through a tall window, speaking to her parents with a stiff, deliberate posture. I owe you more than an apology, Eric finally said. I owe you an explanation. Maybe more than one. She waited. Eric continued, I don't know when I stopped standing up for you. Maybe I never really did. I thought by keeping the peace, I was doing what was best for everyone. But the truth is, I didn't want to feel uncomfortable. And letting them treat you like that, it was easier than confronting the truth. Barbara's gaze was steady. Which truth? That I married someone who doesn't respect you. That I allowed people I call family to act like you were an afterthought. That I let myself forget everything you gave up so I could be part of their world. Barbara looked down briefly, then back at him. I never asked you to defend me, Eric. I just needed you not to look away when it happened. I know, he said, swallowing hard. And I did look away. Over and over. A pause stretched between them. Barbara broke it. So what now? Eric exhaled. I don't know. I think I need to figure out how much of this life is mine, and how much of it was built on appeasement. Barbara tilted her head. And Amanda? He hesitated. She's not a bad person. But she's built her world on rules I don't believe in anymore. Rules that punish people for not fitting a mold. For not being rich enough or polished enough or deferential enough. Barbara didn't respond, letting the silence press him further. He sighed. I love her. But I don't know if that's enough anymore. Barbara nodded slowly. Loving someone who refuses to grow with you isn't loyalty. It's stagnation. Eric winced. That's what I'm afraid of. No, Barbara corrected gently. That's what you've been living. Eric blinked hard and looked away. His voice came softer now. It hurts to admit that. It always does, she said. But it's the only way to stop bleeding under the surface. He didn't speak again for a long time. The wind picked up slightly, brushing his suit jacket back from his frame. Finally, he turned toward the house. I think I need to go back in there. Not for them. For me. Barbara raised an eyebrow. What are you going to say? I don't know yet. But I'm not leaving tonight without saying it. Barbara gave a faint smile. Then go. Eric hesitated only a moment before nodding and walking back toward the house. She watched him disappear through the front doors, his shoulders squared, his posture less uncertain than it had been all evening. Inside, he found Amanda still in conversation with her parents. When she saw him, she straightened, ready to deliver whatever polished defense she had been crafting. But Eric didn't wait. We need to talk, he said firmly, stepping between Amanda and Carol. Amanda blinked. Now? Yes. Here. Now. Carol tried to interject. Eric, if this is about earlier. It is, he said. And it's not going to be buried under pleasantries or charity pledges. Amanda looked between him and her mother. What are you doing? I'm choosing not to be complicit anymore. The guests nearby turned slowly. Even the servers seemed to still. Eric turned to Richard. You treated my mother like a nuisance. Like an interruption. And I let it happen because I thought it was easier to be your son-in-law than to be her son. Richard opened his mouth, but Eric cut him off. Don't. There's nothing you can say that will make this acceptable. He turned to Amanda. And you knew. You saw it. You encouraged it. And when someone finally stood up to you, you didn't apologize, you got angry. Amanda's voice shook. I was trying to protect our family's image. No, Eric said. You were protecting your comfort. But at the cost of mine. At the cost of my mother's dignity. And I can't do that anymore. Amanda's expression collapsed into disbelief. So what does this mean? Eric stood tall. It means you have some thinking to do. And so do I. But I won't keep shrinking myself to fit into your parents' version of respectability. He turned and left the room, not storming, not rushing, but walking with a clarity he hadn't felt in years. Barbara was waiting outside. She didn't need to ask what had been said. She could see it in the set of his jaw, the looseness in his step. She placed a hand on his arm, and he covered it with his own. They stood there a moment longer before turning toward her car, side by side. And for the first time in a long time, Barbara didn't feel like she had lost something. She felt like something had finally returned. The morning after the Langston gathering unfolded with a peculiar serenity. The sky was pale and cloudless, birds chirping like a subtle reminder that the world had kept turning while an entire household of people had their perspectives violently realigned. In the soft light of dawn, Barbara sat at her kitchen table, a chipped ceramic mug of black coffee in her hands and a folded newspaper untouched beside her. Her phone, usually quiet except for the occasional message from her book club or a seasonal coupon alert from the local pharmacy, had already buzzed 12 times, and it was barely 8 o'clock. She hadn't answered any of them. Not yet. She let the coffee warm her fingers, her eyes fixed on the backyard through the window. The lilacs she'd planted years ago were beginning to bloom. The swing set Eric once played on still stood beneath the large oak, now long abandoned and mossy, but still anchored in the soil, still part of her story. Everything felt the same, yet she didn't. A notification chimed again, this time a message from Vivian. Brunch is at 11. You don't have to dress up. Come as you are. That's the whole point. Barbara read it twice, her lips curving into something between amusement and hesitation. She wasn't a brunch kind of person. Never had been. She'd always seen it as a social placeholder for people who wore cashmere in warm weather and used the word network as a verb. But there was something about the way Vivian had phrased the invitation, come as you are, that resonated more than she expected. She put the mug down and stood, stretching slowly, the weight of age and reflection sitting in her joints. Then, without rushing, she walked to her closet. At 10:45, she parked her car in front of a townhouse nestled in a historic block on the Upper West Side. The architecture was graceful, quiet in its elegance, the kind of place that didn't scream wealth, it whispered legacy. She sat in the driver's seat for a minute, wondering whether she truly belonged there, until she remembered the look on Vivian's face when she'd taken her hand in front of that entire room. She got out. Inside, the townhouse opened into a living space that was bright and lived in, not staged or sterile. Books lined the walls. A long oak table sat in the center, already set with mismatched plates and linen napkins, pastries and fruit bowls arranged like artwork, not decoration. The smell of brewed coffee and something citrusy filled the air. A woman in her 60s, with silver-streaked hair and bold red glasses, greeted her warmly at the door. You must be Barbara, she said. I'm Lonnie. Vivian told us you'd be coming. Barbara offered a nervous smile. I hope I'm not early. You're perfect, Lonnie replied. Come on in. Everyone's excited to meet you. The others were already gathered, 10 women, ranging in age, background, and style. One wore a tailored pantsuit and a sharp pixie cut. Another, in a flowing kaftan, greeted Barbara with a kind squeeze of the hand. They introduced themselves casually, no resumes, no accolades, just names, Maya, Estelle, Trina, Farah, Juliet. Women who had lived, failed, risen, and kept going. Vivian appeared from the kitchen holding a steaming teapot. I told them you'd be here. They've been talking about you all morning. Barbara blinked. Why? Because you reminded everyone that decency isn't outdated, Vivian said. And because you handled everything last night with more grace than most of us would've. The group sat. Conversation flowed easily, about public schools, mentorship programs, housing policy, memory, poetry, and grief. Nothing was performative. No one was selling themselves. They were just women who had survived the weight of expectation and emerged still standing. Vivian poured Barbara another cup of tea. I started this group 4 years ago. A place for women who don't fit the usual definitions of power but carry it anyway. Barbara nodded slowly. You built what you needed. Exactly, Vivian said. And I'm asking you to be part of it. Barbara didn't answer immediately. She looked around at the faces at the table, none of them vying for attention, none of them trying to outshine the other. There was a steadiness in the room. An unspoken agreement that everyone belonged exactly as they were. I'm not an executive, Barbara said. I'm not a speaker or strategist or entrepreneur. I'm just. You're not just anything, said the woman in the kaftan, Juliet. You're the reason we're sitting here talking about what legacy actually means. Another woman leaned in. You taught. You raised a son. You showed up for a stranger. That's leadership. Vivian smiled. We don't need another corporate resume. We need truth. Barbara swallowed the lump forming in her throat. Then I'm honored. The brunch continued with laughter and the occasional passing of a photo from someone's wallet or phone. Stories overlapped. Grief met joy. Courage met vulnerability. And through it all, Barbara began to see herself not as an outsider invited in, but as someone who had been long overdue to arrive. When the brunch ended, Vivian walked her to the door. "I'll send you the information for the next gathering," she said. "It's a little more structured. You'll meet more people. There's a mentorship angle, too, young women in transition. We're hoping you'll speak." Barbara chuckled. "What would I say?" "Just what you've lived," Vivian replied. They stood at the steps for a moment before Barbara spoke again. "Do you know why I stopped writing?" she asked, quietly. Vivian looked at her. "Why?" "Because no one ever asked me what I thought. Only what I could fix, or carry, or support. I started to believe my thoughts didn't matter." Vivian didn't interrupt. She waited. But last night, and today, Barbara's voice shook slightly. "For the first time, I didn't feel like I had to earn a seat. I just sat down." Vivian smiled. "Then let's make sure you never forget what that feels like." Barbara walked down the steps and got into her car. But she didn't drive home right away. She sat in the driver's seat for a while, the city noise drifting around her, her fingers resting on the steering wheel, steady and firm. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small notepad she always kept tucked away, the pages yellowed from time. She opened it and, for the first time in years, began to write. Not for a student. Not for a parent. Not for a committee or a lesson plan. But for herself. The following week passed slowly, not because it was uneventful, but because everything that happened seemed to stretch time in subtle, unfamiliar ways. Barbara's phone no longer rang with silence. Instead, it lit up with messages from strangers who had been guests at the Langston event, from former students who had somehow seen a viral video clip of Vivian Dalton's speech, and from women across the country reaching out with words of recognition, gratitude, and quiet solidarity. One message stood out above the rest. It came from a woman named Elise, a former public school principal in a neighboring district. The message read, "I didn't think someone like me had anything in common with someone like Vivian. Until she stood beside you." Barbara read it several times before replying simply, "Neither did I. Until she stood beside me." She didn't reply to every message, but she read them all. Each one landed like a soft, unexpected acknowledgement, fragments of a world she had shaped more than she ever knew. On Friday afternoon, she stood in her kitchen holding a yellow envelope that had arrived by courier. The seal on the back read, "Dalton Holdings," and inside was a formal letter addressed to her, confirmation of the donation made in her name, including the list of public schools that would receive direct funding. Each one had been selected based on proximity to the communities she'd taught in over the years. Barbara scanned the document slowly, carefully, as if it were something fragile. Then she folded it neatly, placed it in the drawer where she kept letters from Eric's childhood, and stood there for a long moment in silence. Later that evening, a knock came at her door. Eric stood on the porch, holding a paper bag and a tired, tentative expression. He was dressed casually, no blazer, no polished shoes. Just jeans, a navy sweater, and a humility that didn't need to be announced. "I brought dinner," he said. Barbara stepped aside without a word and let him in. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where he'd once struggled through math homework, eaten birthday pancakes, and cried after his first heartbreak. Tonight, they shared roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, and quiet. "I left the Langston's house the night you did," Eric said between bites. "I packed a bag that night. Been staying in a hotel. Amanda doesn't know where." Barbara looked up. "Are you planning to go back?" Eric didn't answer immediately. "I think I'm planning to stop lying to myself about what I need." "And what's that?" "Something real," he said. "Something grounded. Amanda and I, we built a life that looked perfect. But it was always tilted. I was always compensating, trying to hold things upright. Barbara took a sip of water. And with me? Eric's eyes softened. With you, I was just forgetting. Trying to belong somewhere that didn't see you meant choosing blindness. And I can't do that anymore. Barbara nodded. It's not too late. But you have to rebuild something true this time. Not perform it. I know, he said. They sat in silence again. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was restorative. Eventually, Eric reached into his coat and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. I started writing this a few nights ago, he said. I wasn't sure I'd ever give it to you. But after everything, I think you should read it. Barbara unfolded it slowly. It wasn't long, just a few paragraphs. But it was raw and thoughtful. It wasn't a perfect apology. It was something deeper. A son reckoning with the quiet betrayals of omission, the weight of inherited arrogance, and the shame of realizing he had asked his mother to be invisible so he could be more accepted. When she looked up, he wasn't watching her. He was staring at his hands. I forgive you, she said softly. But more than that, I believe you. Eric blinked, then nodded, his jaw tightening briefly as he held back emotion. After dinner, they washed dishes side by side. No profound conversation. Just the rhythm of plates, water, and soap. A quiet kind of healing. When he left, Barbara hugged him, not tightly, not dramatically. Just long enough for him to know he was still hers, that love had not been replaced by resentment, only by clarity. 2 days later, Barbara attended the first official session of the mentorship initiative Vivian had introduced her to. It took place at a library annex in Brooklyn, a place filled with sunlight and second-hand books, with worn couches and half-drunk cups of tea balanced on shelves. The young women who entered were cautious but curious, each one with a different kind of guardedness in her posture. Barbara sat among them, not as a savior or symbol, but as someone who had been invisible before and now refused to be. The first girl to speak asked, "What made you want to help people like us?" Barbara responded without hesitation. Because I used to think kindness wasn't enough. But now I know it's the only thing that never loses value. The room exhaled with relief. In the weeks that followed, Barbara's story quietly became a case study among educators and social organizers. Vivian featured her in a national forum about legacy and leadership. One of Barbara's former students, now a journalist, wrote an op-ed titled "The Woman They Tried to Hide," and it spread quickly. Not because it was scandalous, but because it felt familiar. At home, Barbara resumed her routines. Gardening. Reading. Volunteering at the library. But now, her world had expanded. Invitations came, not for appearances, but for presence. Real, honest presence. And one Sunday morning, while walking through her neighborhood with a grocery bag full of produce, someone called out to her from across the street. "Ms. Collins." It was a woman in her 40s with 2 children in tow. "I was in your 6th grade class. You taught us Langston Hughes and how to make sense of silence." Barbara smiled. "You remembered that?" The woman nodded. "I teach now. Because of you." Barbara nodded in return and kept walking, a little slower, a little more aware of the world around her. That evening, as she sat on her porch with a glass of iced tea, she thought of all the things she'd survived, all the times she'd folded herself small to keep the peace. And now, here she was, unfolded. The truth of that party, of Vivian's arrival, of Eric's decision, was never really about scandal. It was about revelation. The richest woman in the room had not been the one with the fortune, but the one who carried her dignity through a storm without losing it once. Barbara never needed a spotlight. The real shock wasn't that Vivian was a billionaire. It was that the world finally saw who Barbara had been all along.